Okay, good. Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. It is Thursday, January 28th, 2021, and this is the meeting of the Edina Housing and Redevelopment Authority. And before we call the meeting to order, we want to let everybody know that, as usual, that notification is that the meeting is being held electronically to comply with the governor's Safer at Home Minnesota order and to ensure the safety of all residents and staff. All members of the HRA, the staff, and the presenters are participating from their homes or offices. And there's a few things that we'd like to cover for those listening in and hoping to participate in portions of the meeting. Today, we don't have any public hearing matters, and so community comment will be the only opportunity to call in to provide comment via phone. You're allowed to speak about anything that is not on today's agenda or scheduled for a future public hearing before the HRA. If you want to call in for community comment, call 800-374-0221. The conference ID number is 618-6549. Again, 800-374-0221. Conference ID 618-6549. You'll be given 3 minutes to speak. Our city manager will be timing the speakers, and maybe Liz Olson as well. I'm not sure which one of them will be doing it, but she'll let you know, or he'll let you know when you go over the 3-minute mark. We ask that individuals not repeat information already presented so we can avoid redundancy. So thanks in advance for your patience as we work to conduct this meeting online using different software types and many people participating from different locations. If we've got a technological glitch, we'll try to get it fixed as quickly as we can. So with that, I'll call the meeting to order and ask Ms. Olson, or is Kirk Allison with us this morning?
Liz Olson is here.
All right, would you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Stanton?
Here.
Commissioner Anderson?
Here.
Commissioner Jackson?
Here.
Commissioner Pierce?
Here.
Mayor Hupland?
Here. Now, next is the Pledge of Allegiance. All rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I think there'll be a flag that comes onto the screen. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The form of meeting agenda in front of us. Is there any change to the meeting agenda, or is there a motion to adopt the meeting agenda as shown?
So moved.
All right. Member Anderson, Commissioner Anderson moves the adoption of the consent agenda. Is there a second?
Second.
The meeting agenda. Commissioner Jackson seconds. We've got a motion and a second to approve the meeting agenda. Any further discussion? Roll call, please, with respect to approval of the meeting agenda.
Commissioner Stanton?
Aye.
Commissioner Anderson?
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson?
Aye.
Commissioner Pierce?
Aye.
Mayor Hupland?
Aye. The agenda is adopted for the HRA meeting. And next is community comment. And as we roll into community comment, we'll now hear from residents who would like to speak to the HRA about something not on today's agenda, not scheduled for a future public hearing. Again, to participate, call 800-374-0221. The conference ID number is 618-6549. Press star 1 to speak. An operator will put you in the queue to speak. And I think if we have Director Bennerat with us, she will probably bring you into the HRA. Director Bennerat, do we have anybody in the queue?
Good morning, Chair Hupland and Commissioners. It is early, and unfortunately, I do not have any callers today. Because there is a slight delay with the broadcast, I would wait a minute or so before moving on with your agenda, just in case someone's trying to connect. My clock shows that it's 7:36, so it just turned to 7:37. So I'll watch my clock and let you know when I have a speaker, or 7:38, whichever is first.
Thank you.
now 7:38 and I still don't have any callers, so I think it's safe for you to move forward with your agenda.
Thank you. All right, so I don't think that we had any comments from 2 weeks ago. I know this is a little bit of a variation from what we've been doing at the city council meeting. But Manager Neal, did you have any comments you wanted to make? I don't think there were.
I do not. I don't recall that we had any at our last HRA meeting.
Okay. The next thing we have is the consent agenda in front of us. And there are several items on the consent agenda. Does any commissioner wish to remove an item from the consent agenda? All right. Hearing nothing, is there a motion to adopt the consent agenda as shown?
So moved.
Commissioner Jackson moves.
Second.
Commissioner Pierce seconds that we the adoption of the consent agenda motion. Any further discussion? Roll call, please, with respect to adoption of the items on the consent agenda by single motion.
Commissioner Stanton,
Aye.
Commissioner Anderson,
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson,
Aye.
Commissioner Pierce,
Aye.
Chair Hovland.
Aye. The items on the consent agenda are adopted in the single motion. Next, we're going to move on to reports and recommendations, and Manager Neal has the first topic under that section of the agenda, and that's the election of officers. Manager Neal.
Thank you, Your Honor. Annually, we elect officers of the HRA. There are 3 officers. There's the chair, which has historically been the mayor. There is a vice chair, and there is a secretary. And those latter 2 positions, we have just selected from among the other HRA members, and there hasn't appeared to be a much of a custom about how we put those positions together.
So this is volunteer time. The historic practice of the mayor being the chair, I'm willing to continue to do that again. But we'll need a vice chair and we need a secretary. The secretary will have some periodic signings that they have to do on HRA documents.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I would volunteer Commissioner Anderson to be vice chair.
All right. Let's see if we can handle something in a single motion here. Is there anyone who would like to step forward or volunteer somebody else to be the secretary?
I'll volunteer James to be the secretary.
I second that.
I know.
So the role of secretary, as the chair noted, is one where we occasionally have to chase you down for signatures. And so I know that Commissioner Pierce doesn't live far from City Hall. If I recall
That is true.
So it would limit the amount of our chase, I would suppose.
Right. Anything for you, Scott.
All right. I think I'm hearing from Commissioner Stanton a single motion to appoint the mayor as the chair, Commissioner Anderson as the vice chair, and Commissioner Pierce as the secretary. Is that right?
You are amazing at the way you can read my words. Yes.
Well, I'm careful about putting words in somebody else's mouth, but thank you. Is there a second to that motion from Commissioner Stanton?
Second.
Commissioner Jackson seconds. Any further discussion? Roll call, please, with respect to those nominated potential officers of the HRA. Ms. Olson?
Commissioner Stanton,
Aye.
Commissioner Anderson,
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson,
Aye.
Commissioner Pierce,
Aye.
Chair Hovland.
Aye. The motion passes. Mayor will continue as chair. Commissioner Anderson will be the vice chair, and Commissioner Pierce will be the new secretary. So succeeding Member Fisher, Commissioner Fisher. All right, and next, Manager Neal gets to wear 2 hats, the executive director hat for the HRA and the city manager hat all the time, I guess. But we need to appoint an executive director as well. Is there someone who would move the appointment of Scott Neal as the executive director of the HRA?
So moved.
Motion, Mr. Chair.
All right. We got a motion by Commissioner Jackson, second by Commissioner Anderson, to appoint Scott Neal as the Executive Director of the HRA. Any further discussion? All right, roll call, please, with respect to that motion. Ms. Olson?
Commissioner Stanton,
Aye.
Commissioner Anderson,
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson,
Aye.
Commissioner Pierce,
Aye.
Chair Hovland.
Aye. Motion passes.
Thank you.
It was a squeaker.
Honored to serve.
Yes. All right, good. Incidentally, I'm looking at Commissioner Jackson's smiling face this morning, and I want to comment, she did a very nice job leading some of those interviews, or all the interviews last night. I had to jump in and out, but more out than in, but she did a nice job on the interviews. We got some great candidates just on that first group. So,
Yeah. Well, thank you,
we'll have the usual dilemma of trying to figure out who to appoint.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, and then Manager Neal, I think you want to introduce the next topic, or do you want to go right to Mr. Neuendorf?
Well, I think because time is of the essence, we want to use every minute we can on this. We'll just go right to Mr. Neuendorf.
All right, thank you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. The main item on our agenda this morning is to discuss a method to move forward on the redevelopment of the city's vacant land over at 5146 Eden Avenue, a piece of property that's been discussed for several years. Last year, on a few occasions, we did discuss ideas for this property and methods to move forward. And you shared your direction with us back in December. So today's action is following up on some of those very preliminary discussions and ideas. So on the call today, we're joined by Dave Anderson and Dean Williamson with Franchute Companies, and also by Alex Hall with United Properties. On your agenda is a Memorandum of Understanding that would identify Franchute and United Properties as joint developers, potentially, to redevelop that vacant land. Dave Kendall, our city attorney, has prepared that memo. We've tried to keep it pretty simple. Essentially, what this memorandum states is that Franchute and United Properties have a temporary exclusive right to put a full sketch plan together for this site to be considered through our regular regulatory process, staff, planning commission, city council, and neighbors, to get some input about what we think realistically could be constructed on this site. Over the years, we've had lots of different dives on lots of different ideas on this site, and so the memorandum does identify a slate of 4 specific items that we would be desiring on the site. Not 2 items, not 20 items, but 4 items. And these come from our past discussions with the Grandview groups over the years, as well as direction from our council members. The first element would be a new commercial building on the property. The second element is a new housing development that would be a for sale product. Most likely it's intended to be a cooperative housing for senior citizens. There would also be a new public plaza. That's the third essential element. And the fourth is a new pedestrian bridge that allows us to span over the railroad tracks. And associated with that would be a future access path to the railroad tracks in the event that it's no longer used as a freight line, if it's turned into a passenger rail or a bike trail or something like that. So those are the 4 essential elements that, based on your direction, we think we really want to see there. The memorandum also identifies what we don't expect to see there any longer. At this point, Metro Transit is not interested in a park and ride on the site, so we wanted to be clear about that we're not expecting to add a couple hundred parking stalls that Metro Transit doesn't want at the time. And also, we're not expecting to see a new publicly owned facility on the property. We've explored that idea on several occasions and typically came to the same conclusion that a new facility was generally not big enough, but far too expensive. So we want to be clear that this site would not be looked at as a new public building, but we would have those new public elements, the plaza, the pedestrian bridge, etc. One of the other key criteria in this memorandum of understanding is a statement about fair value for the land. Since the first Grandview advisory committees were set up back in 2009, 2010, the group and then the city identified the 7 guiding principles for the property that we'd want to pursue. And these were large scale visionary type of principles. And for the city-owned property, we early on discussed that the goal wasn't just to sell it for the most we could possibly get from it, but that instead the preference would be to redevelop it in the best manner for the community. So as we put these 4 essential elements together, commercial building, residential building, public plaza, and then public infrastructure, the memorandum tries to make it clear that this is not the best way to get to squeeze the most dollars out of the property, but yet we do expect a fair value, fair market value for the property. So as the deliverables later this year, we would expect the developers to put forth their methodology on how we'll arrive at that fair market value. And before the HRA makes any further consideration, we can look at the concept plan that's been laid out and make sure that we're agreeable with that, and look at the methodology to determine the purchase price. And if we're agreeable with that as well, then we can move on to the next step and actually enter into a purchase contract with the developers. So this MOU is just the first step, but we think it is the right step to actually compel some action and some future use of this property. As I mentioned, we have Mr. Anderson, Mr. Williamson, and Mr. Hall on the line with us. They, as well as myself, are happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Yes, thank you for that succinct presentation, Mr. Neuendorf. Are there questions from commissioners? Commissioner Stanton?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bill, with respect to the Memorandum of Understanding, I'm interested in the last topic that you talked about, and specifically paragraph 4C of the document. Unlike the other 3 paragraphs, it seems to not be phrased as an action, but as, so I'm trying to understand what it means. It says HRA consideration and approval of the methodology for developers' determination of the purchase price offer within 60 days after the effective date. So what is it that is our responsibility as an HRA that we're going to consider and approve, or consider for approval, or consider and maybe approve, or what is it?
Right. So the expectation there is twofold. Number one, to make a decision whether or not to move forward, and then to make that decision in a timely manner. So the methodology is not going to be a firm dollar amount, but it would be the method that we would use when we actually have a full site plan submittal for the property. So the expectation would be within 4 months, the developer would submit their sketch plan, go through all the planning procedures, at least those very early planning procedures, and give us their methodology of how we'll arrive at a fair price. Within 2 months after that, the HRA board would most likely meet in a closed session to discuss the sale of real estate, and we would, as a group, make a decision on whether or not to move on and enter into a full purchase contract, or whether to table it and do something differently.
So under this, in the document, what is the effective date?
The effective date would be today if it's approved.
So it says that within 60 days of today, we would consider and approve the methodology for the determination of the purchase price.
That is a good catch. That is unclear, isn't it?
It's just phrased in a way that's different. The others all talk about an exact, work exclusively, identify essential, share existing, and this talks about consideration and approval. And I just want to make sure I know what we're committing to.
This says we're going to decide how to decide. Right?
Except that it also says we're going to approve that methodology. I'm not sure we will approve that methodology.
That's a good point.
Maybe
so this
consider. Maybe we should rephrase it to say consider the methodology for developers' determination of a purchase price offer within 60 days.
I think that's a good correction.
So I have a question related to that. If it's
Yes.
60 days from today, not 60 days from when the sketch plan is laid out.
Right. That's what it says. And
Yeah, that's
the
so we're have to make a
process
decision
we're
on
gonna
the
follow. Right.
decision on the price before we know what we're buying, basically, or selling.
So, we have the developers on the line with us. This was one of the paragraphs that we did go back and forth on a fair amount. It might be useful to get their input as far as what timing they see as being realistic.
Yeah. If it's a memorandum of understanding, we all ought to understand the same thing.
Agreed.
Good morning, commissioners. Good morning, staff. Bill, I can respond at least from what our understanding in discussing that timeline that's outlined there. And I think it was important in the concept of this within the early stages, I think that 60-day period, to at least set a framework for the methodology of how value will be determined. So I think it is, in fact, the objective to establish that methodology, not necessarily agree to a price. So really the framework of that being establishing the fact that price will be based on the specific uses, the specific mix of use, the densities of the development, setting a framework for that. So I think the comment Commissioner Stanton made about having that be consideration, simply consideration within the first 60 days, would allow us to get together and get around that topic and understand it moving forward. That would be important, that we establish that framework. That approval could certainly follow once the full density and elements of the project are defined, how that methodology then applies to establishing that specific value. So that could come further down the path in decision making on the price. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
just a question on process here, because I think these are good points that have been brought up. So essentially, the HRA has 60 days, assuming that the memorandum is approved. The HRA has 60 days. It's possible to work independently to begin to brainstorm the method that might be acceptable to the HRA, to then come back in 60 days after approval and find agreement with the developer on that process. Would that be an accurate statement? I don't think that we want to wait for 60 days and say this is a one-sided agreement. I think that we would want to approach this independently as well to see what's in the city's best interest.
Mr. Kendall, tell us a little bit about what you were thinking about with respect to your drafting. You were following the instructions of your clients, of course, but what was your understanding? I want to make sure that, and then go back to Mr. Noondorf too, that we understand just sort of the broad strokes of it so that we can think about how to structure this.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I was following instruction, but to the extent that there's not clarity, if the understanding is that this will just be consideration and no approval will be required within that 60-day time period, I think we can just modify the document to remove that approval language and just characterize it as consideration within 60 days. I think that's what our development partners were kind of getting at in their summary. So unless we have a disagreement on that, I think we could just modify that one term of the document.
Well, it seems to me that it makes sense that we got 120 days to see what they come up with generally in terms of an idea. But it strikes me also that, to Commissioner Jackson's point, that until we know what they have for an idea, how can you have any kind of a fruitful discussion about what the value of the property might be? So maybe go back to Dave Anderson or Dean Williamson or Alex Hall and ask them what they think would be the appropriate methodology here. So we can get this structured the right way. We know this is a non-binding agreement, but nonetheless, the framework is important.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, staff. I think maybe the best way to frame that again is it would be important in this early set of steps to set a framework, a methodology, to say the way we will proceed and determine value. I think that the primary elements of that would be basing it on the specific uses and the density of those uses and other factors related to that specific development concept. So that may certainly, as sketch plan review and so forth occurs, may affect number of units or square footage of development, but that framework of that methodology would be carried forth to apply to that value once that full scope of development was determined. So I think it'd be beneficial. Again, we think it's important to establish that methodology early on, so later in some time period lapse, 120-day lapse, and then there's a discussion about how to establish value. Again, in that 60 days, we're not determining the price. That's not the objective. It's not to say what the price will be. It's simply to say we have an understanding that we're going to use the specific uses, the density, and this specific development to determine that value. And there would be agreement on both sides. So this is a working arrangement. In fact, that methodology outline is something we can draft and start to work on with staff immediately, and would. So I think that'd be a document we develop together and with staff and consultants and legal counsels on both sides, make sure that methodology is clear and understandable.
So my question for you, Mr. Anderson, would be for you and United Properties, the follow-on question, do you feel comfortable that within that first 60 days you can establish a sufficient framework for potential development that would allow us to have a productive conversation about how do we consider establishing a methodology for determining value? And I think Commissioner Anderson's making a good point too, that we may want to get some independent advice on that in terms of what we think the value is. But you think in the first 60 days you can put something together that allows us to have a fruitful conversation?
Mr. Chair, yes, absolutely. I think, again, we'd work with your staff and the city's advisors to establish that methodology framework. So we'd expect that you may ask some independent advisors of your own to review that methodology and make sure you're comfortable with it.
All right, good. Commissioner Jackson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm extremely uncomfortable with that. First of all, it says this is an HRA responsibility, not a joint responsibility. And the city just looked at another development where the developer or the owners already owned the land and they have to work within our constraints. And I'm really uncomfortable talking about how we're going to value this based on how it's going to be developed. It seems unfair to other property owners in the city. And that just makes me really uncomfortable that we would work with the developer to figure out how we're going to set the price. That does not seem fair, and it's not what says in the agreement.
All right, Member Anderson or Mr. Newendorf, would you comment on Commissioner Jackson's concerns that it sounded to me like you were not going to try to set price, but you were going to try to set a methodology by which price would be determined. So would you discuss a little bit more the distinction that you're seeing there, both with respect to the developer and the city?
Sure. Let me jump in. I think an early discussion about price expectations is a good thing to have. In the past, both for this property as well as lots of other properties in town, when the buyer and seller are on completely different pages, it's not even worth hiring an architect. So in this case, for example, if the HRA's goal was to maximize the sale price, we would plop down the two most dense apartment buildings we could possibly fit on the site, build them, to sell them to an investor, and then they'd build them and resell them. That would be the way to maximize our dollar value. But in this case, we want the best project for the community. And when you pursue a condominium or a co-op, your pricing structure is completely different. And so as we've had early conversations, staff, along with United Properties and Franchu, we wanted to make sure that the buyer and the seller are at least on the same wavelength early on. Because if we reach a dollar amount that is, well, if the HRA is expecting, double what the market would bear, then this effort will fail. And so to me, it's not a matter of fairness. It's just a matter of being realistic and trying to get on the same plane to find a deal that both parties can be happy with.
I think you raised an interesting point there. With our past experience on the property with Franchu and with costs that have been absorbed, we've gone quite a ways down the line before we've made some determinations as to what would or wouldn't work, and it's been, no, this wood doesn't work, but we've spent tens of thousands of dollars in that effort. So I see where you're going here, is that before people spend a bunch of money on architects to even do a sketch plan, we look at whether we can establish a general methodology for determining subsequent value. And that will allow both sides to determine whether they want to go forward together or not. So that I get, based on what I've seen happen here in the past. So remember, Stanton's idea to me seems like it has some, he's on the nub of a real good idea in terms of not approving, but just considering methodology. Commissioner Jackson?
Thank you. That helps me understand it better. This is a very complex thing to jump into, so I'm learning as everybody speaks. But thank you, Mr. Neuendorf. That helped a lot.
Mr. Chair and members, this is Alex Hall.
Yes.
I thought I would just add a little bit to what Bill just said, because I think he's kind of spot on there. Is all we're trying to establish or to make sure is that the group, all of us, both parties, are on the same page here. Density is a great example. We just want to make sure, I may be able to pay kind of a similar price per unit for a co-op that an apartment or a condo developer might be able to do. But to Bill's point there, if you drop 200 units on that site versus maybe 90 co-op units, you're going to maximize or get the greater value out of the 200 units. And that's kind of the methodology that we just want to make sure that we understand, so we don't get 90 days down the road, have invested a lot in drawings, talking with consultants, and find that the two parties are on different pages as far as how we're going to value it. So we're certainly not looking to establish that price, because the price ultimately is going to be impacted by the city's participation, for example, in affordability. Ultimately, how many units we're able to get on, the cost of developing that site. There's a lot of work that we're going to need to do before we can establish the actual price that ultimately will be discussed between both parties.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may, let
Yes,
me
sure.
just say back what I'm understanding from that so that to see if I've got this. And that is that the value of this land will be affected by what the city is asking to be put on there. So that we can ask for maybe a little bit more than the general market would give us. So that will be one of the factors. And we will lay out the four corners of what our expectations are in terms of public good or density or things like that before we get into the actual sketch plan and whole process, but that we will lay out what our expectations are, which will affect the value of the land. Is that a good summary?
Mr. Newendorf, you're nodding affirmatively. Is that a-
Yeah, yes, yeah. I think that's a fair statement. You know, and it's an iteration. It's the city working in concert with the developers. We'll also engage our own advisors to get a slightly different perspective. But you know, it's not just the HRA board sitting in a room making the decision. We'll be given, you know, we'll have good advice and good support, as well as a check-in with the developers to make sure that they're on the same page that we're going.
Excellent. Thank you for those descriptions.
All right. So does anybody, yeah, so I think Member Stanton, Commissioner Stanton on 4C has made a good recommendation that we strike the words "and approval." Is that it, Commissioner Stanton?
Well, I think it's rephrasing it
Okay.
to be consistent. So it would be consider a methodology for developers' determination of a purchase price offer within 60 days after the effective date.
Okay. So with that change, does anybody else have any questions? Any other commissioners have questions or staff have comments or the potential development partners have comments? Otherwise, I could entertain a motion that we adopt the Memorandum of Understanding or approve the Memorandum of Understanding with the recommended changes on 4C from Member Stanton.
Mr. Chair.
Stanton. Yes.
So one of the issues here, I think, in a big picture way, is the paragraph that talks about not having a public building. And it seems to me that that is part of what we're saying here, is that we're moving forward on that without a public building, which is in many ways contrary to the details of the Grandview development framework. And my question is, what findings have we created that we can't accomplish that or don't want to accomplish that, or how are we, from a process perspective, pivoting from that decision to move forward with something different?
Executive Director Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Commissioner Stanton. This has been a difficult discussion, and you've been involved in it even before it started as a planning commission member. From a staff perspective, we feel like that particular provision in previous agreements has been driving us to figure out what kinds of public buildings or facilities could we put on the site, rather than what does the site, sort of naturally call out for. And as Mr. Newendorf has mentioned earlier, we've looked at possibilities there for community center, a number of different iterations of community center. We considered art center, and our newest consideration was potential for fire station. In our analysis that we did with the design site analysis firm, the fire station option doesn't work very well in that location for a couple of reasons. One, it's on west side of 100, and two, it's going to most likely be adjacent to a large roundabout, which doesn't facilitate the movement of those large vehicles very well. I think we have just, from speaking for staff, we have just sort of come up against the realization that we have been trying to put too much building, too much development on that site. We do recognize that this is a pretty fundamental choice in terms of what we've been talking about for years compared to what's moving forward. But this is where we stand, I guess, as your representatives, that we feel we can't justify an additional building there when we haven't identified, at least from a city operational standpoint, a building that would fit there and fill the needs of something that we have been looking at in our CIP or any other operational perspective.
Commissioner Stanton, any follow-on questions, comments?
Mr. Chair, what I would say is I understand that we have tried a number of different keys in the lock, so to speak, over the years, trying to achieve the notion of a community center of some type on that site. And I think that it has met with resistance for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes it's cost, sometimes it's space, sometimes it's cost of what you need. It's the type of use you'd need to put on there to make it financially feasible. We got a lot of pushback about the height of the tower if we were going to do something like that to help defray the cost. So I'm willing to move forward with considering this, but it will be important to me as we consider this how the concepts or the values that are articulated in the Grandview Development Framework are achieved with the public space that does end up on this site. So, for Mr. Anderson and Mr. Williamson, that's at least speaking as one commissioner going to be important to me, and as a council member, as I consider land use approvals and the like, creating that community center feeling, even if it's a small C community, small C center, will be important moving forward. So I just don't want to be ambiguous about my interest in continuing to achieve the concepts and the values behind the Grandview Development Framework.
Yep, thank you. Well said. I think all of us that have been involved in this for a while have recognized that study team that you were on years ago now came up with this notion of there should be a combination of public and private uses on that property, and we always thought that the private would help pay for the public, but over time we've learned that that's not true. And so we've looked at a community center, which was the numbers came in at about 70 million, and then we've got all the traffic issues around there. So we've thought about a lot of different options, but I do like the idea that we're continuing to look at a public element to this. And it says in the central portion of the property, I'd be more flexible than that in terms of where that might be located, depending on what a sketch plan looks like. But for me too, I think having a public element to this is important because that was part of the framework conversation. As to the fire station notion, it strikes me that if there were a building on the site, a medical facility, for example, other factors aside, we could still look at the issue of whether or not we might fit within the confines of an existing building. And so the language about no expectation of a new public building, to me, means a standalone kind of building that would have a dominant public use. But it wouldn't preclude a conversation as we move along here about whether it makes any sense to have a fire station, for example, as part of another otherwise private developers' piece of property. So I think with the way the MOU is framed, the fact that it's non-binding, that paragraph 2G is an important piece of language, I think, for all of us. Doesn't bind us to any future agreement. Lets us look at the possibilities here. Lets us establish a framework for how we are going to value the property. But it's merely intended to be a written representation of the parties' intent to go forward together to see if we can figure something out. As somebody said, it ends up being an agreement to agree on how we go forward. So I'm comfortable with the change that Commissioner Stanton made in moving forward to the next step to see what we can accomplish here. Commissioner Jackson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm comfortable moving forward as well. This is a strange deal where we are both a property owner and the regulator. So it's extremely uncomfortable. I'll be honest about that, but I understand that's the situation. It's not anybody involved. And I do want to thank everybody for a thoughtful agreement. I went through this sort of several different ways, and it does seem to cover things well. Going forward, though, I do want to stress that I'd like to have some independent help in figuring the value, because that's very important that we do get some value out of this as well as a nice development. But this is an asset that the city owns. I'm reluctant to give up public property. I understand the difficulties of having developed this, but new land is not created any day. So when we give up public property, I want to make sure that we get as much value as we can given the constraints of our public needs for this property. So it's a strange situation, but I think you've done a really good job of laying out the parameters of what is really a novel situation. So I'm in favor of this.
Other thoughts? Otherwise, we can go with Commissioner Pierce.
I in principle, I definitely agree with the position we're taking. I just wanted to underscore what Commissioner Stanton said. I think it really is important for us, as often as we can, to be clear about some of our aspirations with any particular piece of property. Because I think if we go into a development phase and we're out of sync in terms of what the community might be looking for and what we may be looking for, we end up doing a lot of work, and then we get to a point where we have a vote and then we don't agree and we disapprove development. So I definitely appreciate Commissioner Stanton raising that point about ensuring that we have appropriate public use of that site. And that mixed use, I think, opens it up for a developer to be creative in helping us figure out how to achieve that.
Thank you, Commissioner Pierce.
Yep.
Commissioner Anderson.
Very briefly, I agree with everything that's been said, and I want to thank Commissioner Stanton and Chair Hovland for referencing the potential public use there. I think that's an important point. There is an expectation in the community and longstanding something occurring, so we can be open to that possibility. So I thank you for that consideration, and I think we've hammered out, I think, a workable memorandum of understanding. So thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Anderson, would you care to move the MOU adoption with the change made in paragraph, I think it was 4C by Member Stanton or Commissioner Stanton?
So moved.
There a second?
Second.
Second by Commissioner Pierce. Any further discussion? Roll call, please, Ms. Olson.
Commissioner Stanton,
Aye.
Commissioner Anderson,
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson,
Aye.
Commissioner Pierce,
Aye.
Chair Hovland.
Aye. Motion passes. The MOU is approved in its amended form or modified form. All right. Now we're going to go to a conversation. We got the executive director comments. Manager Neal will do an introduction, and Stephanie Hawkinson is going to do a short presentation here. Vice Chair Anderson, newly appointed. I've got a commitment I've got at 9 o'clock, and I hope to do it from my office and not from here. So we'll see how it goes. But I may have to have you take over to finish the meeting here. We'll see.
It'd be an honor to do so. Thank you.
So thank you, commissioners, and we understand that there's a hard out at 8:32. So we have also prepared from a staff perspective to work within that, so we can scale back or up in case this presentation. But our annual HRA our HRA bylaws require an annual review of the bylaws. Staff have done a review of the bylaws. We don't see anything from our perspective that we would recommend that you change. That's my item 10B. But we also, in our bylaws, require sort of an annual report, year in review presentation. And Bill and Stephanie have been the primary authors of that. And I'm not sure which one of them is going to start it off, but we're ready to deliver that to you today within the time allowed.
Sure, thank you. I'll start it off and Stephanie can jump in. So it's important to always remember what the HRA did and what we accomplished. 2020 was one of those years where, boy, there was a lot of work and a lot of spinning the wheels with the pandemic. But this year in review document is included in the packet. We'll have it posted to the city's webpage in the next day or so as well. But some of the big accomplishments of 2020. Number one, working with our businesses and our residents that were in financial distress due to the pandemic. That took a little bit of our money that we eventually got reimbursed for with CARES Act funding, but it took a lot of staff time and commitment to work through those issues. But in addition to that matter, there was also a fair amount of new construction that was begun, particularly in the affordable housing realm. So on the first page of the report is a list of accomplishments. We finished, or a private developer finished the new Lorient Apartments at the corner of Sunnyside in France. That's the first new construction at 44th and France in many years. 3 of those apartments are affordably priced and targeted to residents with disabilities. There's also, for the first time, official shared public parking at 44th and France, something that's been talked about for decades. Stephanie Hawkinson has been working hard in the affordable housing realm. MWF Properties broke ground at 70th and Amundsen. I think that building has a roof on it already, and I think windows are going in. Also worked hard on getting to the groundbreaking of that new affordable housing on 76th Street with Aon. That broke ground just about a week ago. It was supposed to get started at the end of the year, and then a few year-end delays kicked in. The Come Home to Edina program for second mortgages was still rolled out. Stephanie completed 13 of those second mortgages to help make single-family housing in Edina more affordable. And then also this HRA board worked very well with the Housing Foundation to put together a loan package for that property at 4040 West 70th, a site that is slated to be affordably priced senior housing. So those are the main highlights. The report has updates on each of the projects that are larger in scale and kind of on the radar of the HRA, in that they address goals of either redevelopment, housing, or business growth. There's also a summary this year of it's always in there, but each of the tax increment financing districts, as well as a summary of the incremental tax collections. The most notable one, this is on the third page, our Southdale 2 TIF district. This past year, we collected just under $6 million in incremental taxes. So that does not include all the regular taxes that went to the schools and the county and the city. But that Southdale district expires this year in 2021. So we're in our last year of collections. In the last few weeks, we did have meetings with our colleagues at the Edina schools and the Richfield schools. Executive Director Neal put those meetings together to alert them that that district is coming to a close. And while it's been highly successful on many grounds, it's been so successful that each of those taxing bodies will or should expect to get a check in excess incremental funds. These were increment funds that were collected that frankly exceeded our budget, and so they'll be returned directly to the taxing agencies. So they're notified that they should expect that coming next year. Happy to stand for any other questions, but I know time is of the essence, so we'll wrap it up there.
Questions for Mr. Neundorf? Comments? All right, very good. Well, thank you for accommodating the schedules of several of us, I guess. Appreciate that. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Commissioner Jackson moves.
Second.
Commissioner Stanton seconds. I should have asked Executive Director Neal if he had anything further.
No,
All right.
nothing further.
All right,
Yep.
good. All right, thank you, everybody. We got a motion and a second for adjournment. Any further discussion? Roll call, please. Ms. Olson?
Commissioner Stanton,
I'm going to say aye, and thank you, Ms. Olson, for shaking up the order so that I can keep my brain nice and nimble, even if it's 7:30 on a Thursday morning.
absolutely. Commissioner Anderson,
Aye.
Commissioner Jackson,
Aye.
Commissioner Pierce,
Aye.
Chair Hubland.
Aye. We stand adjourned.
Thank you.
Very
Thank
much.
you.